Voila. And we are live. Hi everyone, and our sincere apologies for starting a little bit late. We had a few technicalities. We had to get out of the way. It's exciting to be doing my first live, obviously, but also Africa at least first live and on LinkedIn, and I'm hoping that we can have as many more in the near future. My name is Maggie Umotesi. I'm the managing editor for Mansa Media, and for those joining in from all around the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live on climate financing and how it can unlock Africa's development potential. I had written so many things I thought I would put down to give us context of the conversation, but I know we've taken already 10 minutes of everyone's time, so I'm just going to keep it simple as I engage my panelists. Now, exploring how we can mobilize financing to support ongoing projects on the continent will be the main topic of this discussion for about the next 15 minutes or more. And, I want to put down a few housekeeping rules for just the audience. Please, if you have any questions to the panelists, just submit them using the chat button on the page. We'll be able to read them out at the end of this conversation, or also be able to address them on Africa at least LinkedIn page. I will also just put just a simple line of statistics to give us a tone of this discussion. Obviously, as many of us know today, Africa attracts less than 4% of climate financing. And if we look at some of the estimates given by the Climate Policy Initiative, there is a requirement of about close to 300 billion US dollars. Obviously, they give about 277 to be able to meet the 2030 climate goals. And the annual climate finance flows to Africa at the moment stand at about 30 billion US dollars. Obviously, that gives us a whole opportunity to look at, the funding gap and how to be able to address it in Africa, but also be able to attract in private climate financing. Let me now introduce my panelists without any further ado. We have Dauda Semben, the CEO of Africa at least, Ms. Asana Alio, the country director for the Global Green Growth Institute here in Dakar, and Raymond Jupin, the chief economist and head of strategy and research at UNDP Africa. Dauda, I really want to kick off this conversation with you to just get a context of the financing currently available to the African continent. Just to give us a baseline, where is it coming from and what is it being used for?
Thank you very much, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be with you today and to be also with my colleague from UNDP and the Green Climate Fund. I think the issue of climate finance is extremely critical for countries like ours in Africa in general. As you know, that's an issue that has been profoundly discussed during the recent COP27 summit. And I think that's actually a testimony to how important the finance or the climate finance issue is for those countries. As you know, what we have seen in recent years is actually a resurgence of extreme weather episode that has been creating a lot of strategy and damage in developing countries, not only developing countries, but the world in general. But I think what the issue is actually developing countries are much more sort of vulnerable to, especially in Africa, is much more vulnerable to climate change. And it has been a big issue that actually adapts to other challenges that these countries were facing and that were requiring them to mobilize resources to develop infrastructure to respond to the need to improve basic social services. So basically, when you're in that situation, of course, it is extremely critical to be able to raise enough resources to address the climate challenges that those countries are facing. So I cannot really emphasize enough on how critical it is for those countries to mobilize resources for that purpose. And of course, it requires a collective effort. I will certainly get back to the detail about how it can be done, but at this stage I wanted to really emphasize on the criticality of mobilizing finance for addressing natural disasters and climate change related issues in Africa and in developing countries in general.
I really want to bring in, obviously we'll come back to that, but I want to bring in, when you talk about, how much is needed and, where the money is being spent at the moment, I want to bring in Raymond to help us understand how institutions like UNDP are really working to accelerate, climate financing, Raymond, but also to touch on a bit on some of the work that you have been doing with UNDP. How do we mobilize the private sector to take part?
Thank you so much, Maggie, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today and also to be part of this high-powered illustrious panel. This is in the wake of the recently concluded COP27. I think this is an issue that's front and center in all of our minds. COP27 was very clear and unanimous in recognizing the importance of just energy and just climate transitions, particularly as it pertains to Africa. But where we seem to come up a little short with this particular conversation is how we're going to finance it. And Dauda was really clear when he said the amounts that we need, the magnitude of the funding is quite significant. And so we're going to have to be very creative in how we ensure that we are able to meet this if Africa is going to be able to transition, not just effectively, but also in a timely manner. Thinking about climate financing, there are three things that come to mind. One is the amount. Yes, Africa has been raising a lot more in terms of climate financing. If you look at the decade from 2000 to 2009, total that Africa received is estimated to be about 0.8% of the global amount, roughly about $5 billion. If you look at the decade that followed, 2010 to 2020, it jumped up to 60 billion from 5 and 2% of the global total. But if you compare this with what Africa needs, it's really small. And so therefore, we have to find ways to scale up the amounts. And this is where issues like global pledges of 100 billion to support Africa, global pledges like how do we use the rechanneling of SDRs to African countries becomes very important, because we really have to scale up. The second thing that we are thinking about is affordability. Even if we scale up, most of these resources aren't going to come in the form of grants. They're going to come in the form of either blended or concessional or direct investment. And according to the IEA in Paris, the costs of capital for renewable energy in Africa is 7 times higher than the cost in developed countries. This is not just unequal, but it's what causes the sort of external debt service stress that African countries face on a day-to-day basis. And so it's not just the amount of capital, it's the cost of capital for renewables. We look at the greenfield portfolios for most African countries in the energy sector, and we do see this. And this is partly because of the high upfront costs of things like solar and wind and renewables in Africa, because you have to build the entire infrastructure to make these things happen. You have to think about the grids, etc. And so there's the affordability. The third thing would be the accessibility. For most of Africans who do not live in large cities, it's a problem because the grid doesn't go that far. How do we have the financing that would bridge those gaps and enable people who are not in large cities, who do not have access to large financial institutions, access the capital, even if it's available? So you have the amount, the affordability, and the accessibility. And to come to your question, Maggie, what do development organizations like ours, what role could they play? I think one is advocacy. Secondly, there is an catalytic role that could be played that could involve things like de-risking the investments to bring the costs down. That would include things like increasing information flows so that the ratings of countries, the credit ratings of countries will become more favorable to investment flows. To also include involve things like crowdsourcing the effort so that we are partnering more judiciously to bring the sort of global heft to this climate financing question that I think Africa desperately needs.
I want to bring you, Asana, because as Raymond was talking, you kept on agreeing, nodding your head, obviously. And he's mentioned, a couple of things needed, but, one of the things that you keep hearing also when you do a lot of research around this is, do we really have bankable projects to be able to attract this right investment? What are your thoughts? I know how with GGI, you also focused on really bringing in money into climate change and, creating projects that can actually help governments mitigate the effects.
Sure. Thank you so much, Maggie. Thank you for bringing me on this interesting and very intense panel. Following COP27, as you know, some of the key points have been raised by Dauda and Raymond as well. And some of the key feedback you provided, Maggie, is that in terms of the needs of the continent, it is much bigger. When we're looking at the overall percentages of Africa, it is very flagrant and it's obvious that we do not have the resources. The percentages are very small compared to the actual needs. However, I would say following COP27, we saw that there was a loss and damage fund that was created for vulnerable countries. I know there's a huge celebration on the loss and damage. However, I think the reason is because it took us 30 years just to get to the fund, the creation of the fund, and even the terms of the fund are still being designed and configured. But the most important thing is to know that it took us 30 years, and this is, of course, African countries and Caribbean countries. So that's one step I would say is positive. Does it address the fact that we're still getting only 11%, or I would say based on the statistics in terms of the overall resources to Africa? No, it doesn't. How do we make sure as African countries, I think the question becomes, how do we address those issues and the gap that we see? For GGGI as a whole, when we're looking at it, when you hear statistics, for example, I know Bloomberg often gives some statistics, and based on Bloomberg, we're looking at 277 billion based on the statistics you gave, and we're looking at about maybe 30 billion coming to the continent overall. And if it's the case, it doesn't take into account the loss and damage component. We're just, going into the actual basic needs without putting in, with the moment you add the loss and damage into that equation, then those numbers are completely skewed. So you would then realize that the actual need itself is much greater than what we are looking at. With the climate change in place, I will give one good example, is that I often refer to this example in terms of agriculture, because when we look at the agricultural calendar, working in Senegal, we're looking at climate smart agriculture. How do we look into the energy space? How do we look into agriculture space? How do we look into the trade? And how do we make sure that farmers have access to the right resources in terms of crops and also access to seeds and fertilizers that endure climate change, that can survive? Because the biggest thing is in Senegal, for example, majority of the economy does not live in Dakar or doesn't live in the big cities. The majority of the economy is actually centered around rural areas. Those are the ones that are farmers, and whatever they grow is what they consume. We're currently working on a project with GGGI on climate smart agriculture in Senegal in the north. And the goal is to make rice production much more efficient so that Senegal can become autosufficient in rice production. In doing so, we saw that climate change completely changed the agricultural calendar in terms of crops. It also changed the type of seeds and fertilizers we were to use. And when you're looking at those two factors, and also the people that are farming will need new climate smart agriculture training and capacity building, in addition to the technology, but most importantly, the energy component. You can no longer use the same energy for rice farming. It comes with irrigation, which is water. So when you add all of that, that's just one sector, and you're looking at the seeds, you're looking at agriculture, you're looking at energy, you're looking at capacity building. When you're looking at the total investment just for that particular sector, you do realize that climate change has a huge impact. If majority of the population does not have access to its number one food, which is rice in terms of consumption, we're going to continue to import. If there is a war or anything that impacts, like we've seen recently in Ukraine, it impacts the entire discussion of what is and the need and the importance for African countries to be autosufficient during sessions like COP27. So I was agreeing with Raymond a lot because one thing he said that I thought was really, really important is affordability and accessibility. Climate change is not something that is less costly, as most people say. The damage it brings is much greater, but the actual cost itself is often overlooked. And how do we make sure that the needs that are on the table are actually being addressed? And for us, we look at what are the types of financing mechanisms that we can put in place. So for such a project, we're looking at blended finance. And with the blended finance, we need to find innovative financial solutions. That's the only solution we see so far. No matter how much, yes, there's concessional. We can look at the different options. However, blended finance, to me, from my experience and the work that we're doing in the various sectors, that's one. We're also working in different sectors, for example, working with rice mills, making their energy efficient so they reduce their energy production. And also the significant terms of the CO2 reduction, right? We do have countries that have pledged to the Paris Agreement. We need to look at other options such as, carbon markets, maybe look at how do we trade, how do we make sure quickly we get African countries the capacity building they need so they can negotiate globally, so they can negotiate bigger scale and bring in additional revenue. Recently in Senegal, we had UCG, which is now Sonaged in Senegal, the waste company, negotiate for carbon trading, and that's excellent. And that's going towards a waste and compost production because it reduces the CO2 emissions reduction in the environment. And these are options that we can begin to look at. But the goal is, like I said, blended finance for me, I think is the answer. Will African countries achieve the numbers that we are talking about overnight because of COP27? I do not believe it will come overnight. I'm a realist. I don't want it to say it's going to happen. It won't happen. I don't see it. However, the fact that after 30 years, a big milestone was struck and that there's a loss and damage fund was created, yes, it's a good milestone. But the real reality is I think African countries need to come to the table and identify ways where we can maximize the African trade agreements. How do we maximize that? Because that's important. How do we make sure we provide seed and fertilizers that are able to be climate resilient? How do we provide climate resilient solutions to adaptation and mitigation solutions? And when there's a rain, there's acidic rain that impacts our roads. So the investments that companies and countries are making becoming obsolete after 3-4 years because of climate change. So these are things that we need to quickly look into and adapt. I mean, I will stop here, but I have more, but I think I definitely do agree that accessibility, affordability is key, but advocacy is key. And for us, not only do we work in the finance side, but we also work in policy. I think policy is a big component, and not just in terms of coming up with a policy, but driving it and operationalizing the policy to make sure that it's implemented in the different sectors of the economy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nagi. You were speaking for quite some time. So Dauda nodding his head in agreement with a lot of the things you're saying. But I also know that, Dauda, you've done extensive research, especially when it comes to finding innovative ways to really, finance climate change. How do you see this kind of collaboration between the public and private sector to mobilize finance?
Thank you, Maggie. Indeed, I've been also nodding my head, while Asana was talking. I think she talks about a lot of issues that I fully agree with, especially the fact that blended finance needs to play a big role in mobilizing climate finance. But I think she's also right that the agricultural revolution needs to be part of the adaptation conversation. I think that's extremely critical. And of course, I think the issue of affordability that Raymond talked about also cannot be sort of overlooked. What we have seen so far is actually over the times, the 100 billion pledge, of course, has not been met, but actually what has been met has been primarily in the forms of a loan, actually disproportionately in the forms of loan. And I think we need to come back to that situation where, as Raymond was pointing out, we need to have more grants, but also more concessional resources to allow developing countries to also play their part in resolving a problem they are not necessarily actually the one that causes the most. As if you take Africa only, for instance, the greenhouse emissions are less than 5%. So I think maybe to respond to your question, indeed, I think as my colleagues pointed out, there is a lot that needs to be done besides in terms of advocacy, but also in terms of research. We have tried to do a lot. As we always said, you cannot solve an issue if you don't understand the issue. It means that you need first to really conduct the necessary research so as to understand what the data is saying, to understand what's the scope of the problem is. As we talked about the magnitude of the problem, you need to estimate what are the financing needs and how you actually need to conduct the policy response to the crisis that we are facing. And all of that has to be done through research, through evidence-backed research, and by making sure that, I guess, the policymakers, those who ultimately actually have to conduct policy, are endowed, receive the right tools, the right information that they need to conduct effective policy. So AfriCatalyst has been doing a lot of work on climate finance. We have a large pool of experts who are former policymakers or former IMF or World Bank staff who can really understand the core of the issue, and who have been also working with our team to make sure that we identify, for instance, how multilateral institutions like the IMF can play a more effective role in addressing climate finance need. We have been also advising some policymakers in terms of how climate finance can be mobilized more. And this is something that we do focusing on African countries, which are actually the main region of where AfriCatalyst is intervening.
Sorry, can you hear me? I want to bring you in, Raymond. I mean, we have banks across the continent. When you think of Afrexim, think of FDB. What role do they have to play in supporting, especially being able to support governments in, financing some of these projects?
Thank you so much, Maggie. And let me just, it's a really good segue from Dauda's excellent intervention, talking about the need to be very circumspect about how we approach the financing question. I think that the climate issue is a particular emergency for Africa. And I think that we have to go outside the financing as usual box. This is where we think outside the box. And we have to think about a whole financing ecosystem. So yes, existing banks, regional banks, development banks, investment banks all have a role to play. But I think we need to, let's go back to the basic principles. We know how much we need, more or less. We know that the traditional sources are coming up way, way, way short relative to what Africa needs if the investment is going to be put in place. So I think the first thing we need to do is to engage Africa's intellectuals. African thinkers have to, play a specific role, because I don't think the answers are going to come from outside the continent. I think African intellectuals have to say, if we have to structure blended finance in a way that will make sense for a continent where the vast majority is non-formal, is in the non-formal financing sector? What would it look like? How would we price risk in a different way? And how would we ensure that we have an efficient connection between capital and opportunity, the whole financial intermediation? Because a lot of the banks on the continent don't really do banking in terms of financial intermediation. They are more like piggy banks. You put your money here today, tomorrow you come, you get it back. And not to how are you connecting the need in terms of investment with the availability. I think that's one first thing that we need to do, break the mold completely. Second thing we need to do is we need to look at, okay, so what resources does a continent have? How do we have a climate financing model that includes Africa's resources to solve Africa's problems? Yes, Africa is not a major contributor to climate emissions, but Africa is disproportionately affected. And so there has to be a way that our resources, according to UNCTAD, almost $90 billion gets lost in terms of illicit financial flows each year. If we could find a way to identify and recoup a proportion of that every year, could we as a continent, as the African Union, agree that those resources will go towards climate financing? That's a possibility. It's also a possibility to think through the almost $90 billion a year in diaspora flows. Are there ways to have diaspora-based bonds that are focusing on climate financing? I think when we think about climate financing, we should move away from assuming that it's going to be the donors or donor organizations. There's lots of creativity and possibility within Africa that I don't think we are tapping enough. But there are also ways in which this could be done within the context of existing regional organizations, regional banking organizations that do have the reach to be able to do so. So what I think we have to do in terms of financing is flip the narrative and say there's a lot more that we can do within the continent to do this. And lastly, there was an interesting article in Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago, written by three researchers, including Vij Ramachandran, who is with the Breakout Institute in California. And what they put on the table was that climate financing also has to mean development financing. Because you invest in development, you invest in agriculture, then you are enabling communities to make the lifestyle changes that you need for climate change. And that's usually missed when we are in these stratospheric conversations about billions of dollars for loss and damage, etc. The bread and butter issues on the ground could be the catalyst for change. And so that is also something that we might want to consider. Sorry for muddying the conversation a little bit, Maggie, but I think that we have to challenge ourselves to think differently about these issues.
I mean, listening to you, it kind of feels like, are we approaching climate financing in a wrong way? Are we spending in the right places? And I want to bring you in on that, hearing Raymond's thoughts.
So great intervention, Raymond. That was awesome. I would say that for me, recently I was reading the New York Times, and one of the big discussions, and I think it's been years on, there's been a discussion of it's time to drastically reform the World Bank, right, and other MDBs so that we can scale up climate financing. The only thing I would say for me is that we need to look at how Europe and all the other countries are able to mobilize climate financing. They're able to come up and create climate funds. I think for me, the biggest solution would be Africa should come up with a simple climate fund and hold each other accountable. And we find a way, like Raymond suggested, is that it needs to be a development fund, and we need to find a way to mold it so that it addresses Africa's needs. Because we cannot just take the copy and paste model, it's not going to work. And for it to have our own solutions, we need to have our own fund and we need to manage it properly and it needs to be governed properly. And there needs to be a replenishment process so that the fund, the challenge is a lot of these funds that I've seen, especially, I wouldn't, want to say certain names, but you see a big fund get this launched, after a while, it's not replenished. So what is the viability of the fund? So I think for me, that is what I see as a potential solution to address the climate fund issue.
I'm gonna have some. Sorry, is that my? Just checking if that's my audio. I think I'm gonna have some news to give to all of you. Unfortunately, our live is we are not live on LinkedIn, much as we really wanted to be so live on LinkedIn. So it's actually stressing me out because the stream says it's still sending data. Nevertheless, I want to continue this conversation. The audience will be able to see it in real time. We'll make sure we upload it as soon as this conversation is okay. I really wanted to let you know, as I'm also made aware by the technical team, and my apologies about that. I just have never understood technicalities sometimes of live broadcasting. Sometimes, catches you when you least expect it. My apologies. Hello?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to put that out. Thanks, Hassana,
No.
for your intervention. I mean, there's so much for me to especially learn, and I mean, conversations around climate financing, obviously, COP27 being done and moving into COP28, and mentioning, and hearing some of your thoughts around, for example, creating a fund specifically for climate financing, or even maximizing on the diaspora to actually be able to bring in financing into the continent, for me is one of the things that I actually, feel like we should think out of the box, like Raymond has said initially. Dauda, I just want to bring you in because I know that Africa at least works closely with development institutions, but also with the private sector and governments across Africa. Is this possible? Is this actually something that can be achieved realistically?
Yeah, I would certainly say yes, it is possible, but actually it requires something that certainly Africa Catalyst also help to do, which is partnerships. I think Asana talks about the idea of promoting blended finance. Well, when we talk about blended finance, we are talking about different partners trying to get together and see how they can actually make financing less costly. And I think it means that we need partnership between the public and the private sector, but also between the public, within the public, because when we talk also about the public, we are talking about national authorities, but we also talking about institutions like a UNDP. And I think all needs to be together, get together and make sure that they build those sustainable partnerships that are aimed at helping address climate change in the most effective manner, either by helping understand the issue more better, either by helping actually mobilize more resources, more finance needed for adaptation and mitigation purposes. So I cannot emphasize enough the power of partnership in helping address climate change. And I think something that certainly needs to be put out there on the table, and certainly something that Africa works a lot on. That's for one. I think Raymond is right. We need to think outside the box. We need innovative solutions to help mobilize more resources from domestic sources. And I certainly can agree more with what both Raymond and Asana have talked about, either the idea of putting together carbon market so as to help also catalyze private finance for climate adaptation and mitigation purposes. The idea also, of course, of blended finance. Maybe one thing that I can add to those innovative solutions and that can actually have the potential to help moving forward is the idea of debt for nature or climate swaps. What are those? Those are instruments that can be used to climate finance more affordable, which is the issue that Raymond was talking about earlier. We have to put things into perspective. Right now, the IMF and the World Bank have estimated that more than half of low-income countries are either in high risk of debt distress or they are in debt distress. What it means is those countries, by definition, many of them actually are faced with daunting challenges, daunting debt challenges. So what we actually think also, and that's what has been done in recent years, is it is important to put together the idea of finding innovative solutions for debt buildup, at least to help countries address the debt vulnerabilities. Put that together with the idea of actually making sure that those countries also have enough resources to address their vulnerability to climate change. One figure that I can share with you, for instance, it is estimated that over the next 4 years, 58 countries that are among the most vulnerable countries to climate change will owe in debt service payment about $500 billion in debt service payment over the next 4 years. That's a staggering figure. And, you know, you actually are facing a double sentence here as a country that is vulnerable to climate change. First of all, on the upfront, you are actually facing higher borrowing costs because investors know that you are actually vulnerable to climate change, which means that there is a high likelihood that the country is facing natural disasters. So basically, there is a premium that is added to any borrowing cost that you face for once. And second, well, when the natural disasters arrive, then you are left with a lot of damage and losses that you need actually to also actually factor in your budget. So basically, those countries are facing a double sentence, which is actually making it extremely tough for a vulnerable country. So I think we need to find those solutions where we can make sure that countries, as they also address their debt vulnerabilities, are able to also raise and mobilize climate finance. And I think the idea of moving forward more on the debt for nature instrument or climate swap is something that needs to be actually taken more on the table. The good news is until now, we knew that a few countries have been, experiencing those debt for nature instruments like Seychelles. But what we have seen is actually during COP27, many countries came up with some proposal in this direction, whether it is Gabon, that also wanted to raise funds for through those means for marine conservation, whether it is Kenya and many other African countries that actually came up and put forward on the table in front of investors some potential solutions that are actually consistent with the idea and those innovative instruments that I just talked about. I think that's something that we certainly need to encourage more in terms of advocacy, in terms of research, and I certainly now believe that many UN agencies, including the UNDP, actually are very well placed to help in that area. And of course, we at AfriCatalyst continue to also work partners with our partners to make sure that this is also something that is really accorded enough attention moving forward.
Raymond, I want to bring you into weigh in on Dauda in terms of these innovative ways. Is this something you can weigh in on?
No, absolutely, and I agree with him 110% as far as the debt stress issue is concerned. But here's the catch-22 that African countries are in. One, they desperately need to invest billions of dollars in climate finance. And most of that investment is going to come in the form of loans, even if they are concessional. But half of them are already debt stressed. So how do they get this additional climate finance when they're already debt stressed? And I think this is something that we cannot assume away. We, as a global community, African countries as a regional bloc, have to come together and say, this is not a circle that we can square. We have to say, climate financing has to be special. We cannot have African countries paying 7 times the cost of borrowing relative to developed countries. At a minimum, it should be an even playing field. And I think that the global community and regional organizations should take this seriously, because that is one way to ensure that African countries are not afraid to invest. Because I'm sure there are a lot of countries now that are saying, yep, we need to invest in climate, but could we afford it? And we want to, I think that that is one burden we have to remove from the African countries and find ways to de-risk the investments so that it's not costing African countries that much. Do I have a ready answer for that? No. But I do know that there are hundreds, even thousands of very smart African financiers and economists who can come up with a solution to that. So that's the first thing. The second one, and this is where I want to challenge Dowda a little bit, on the issue of swaps and carbon trading. I'm not familiar with all of the initiatives, but I do know a little bit about the Gabonese proposal, which I think is a fantastic proposal to raise money through carbon trading. But the costing, the pricing of the carbon is done outside the continent by people who really don't understand or even value as much as it should be the what Gabon has to trade. So I think the last time I checked, the amount that was being offered was less than half of what other parts of the world are being offered for similar or even inferior carbon trades. So the question is, how do we ensure that there is not an Africa premium on carbon trading that disadvantages, that makes African countries receive far less than they should from carbon trading? I know that the Economic Commission for Africa was working on a carbon register. We need one so that we could ensure that there is a fair deal for African countries. So if you'd allow me, Maggie, let me ask Dowda.
Please go ahead.
How do we go forward with an excellent idea like swaps and carbon trading when the fundamentals are not there? And who puts that in place?
I certainly fully agree with you, Raymond. I think it is critical to make sure that we have a well-functioning carbon market as soon as possible. That would be in line with the Paris Agreement, and that would be also one of the most effective ways to raise private climate finance. I think so. The faster we can really make it happen in Africa, the better, of course, because I think there are some well-functioning carbon markets elsewhere in the world, including in the European Union, including in China. So we need to really also have a similar positive development in Africa. Now, I think certainly when we also talk about climate finance, we are talking about issues around justice. I think the more a country emits greenhouse, the more it is supposed also to help in terms of mobilizing the finance that is needed to mitigate those emissions. So I think it's really fair to make sure that those countries that actually emit more pay more to address the problem, and those that can help actually reduce those or mitigate the emissions actually also benefit more. And when you talk about Gabon, you're talking about Gabon, a country that has a big big resources in terms of nature, in terms of forests, and all know that actually forests are a very good carbon sink, which means that I guess the service that Gabon can actually give to the world is actually very important in the sense that actually the forests that are and the nature that the biodiversity that we have in Gabon actually can play a big role in reducing emissions. So it is really fair. It is really critical that that country, as it's tried to play its role, actually get a fair deal in terms of how carbon would be traded with it. So it's not only Gabon, but it's all African countries and all developing countries. And I think this is certainly, you're right. I think the initiative that the UNECA has been taking can be helpful in terms of the carbon register. But I think we also, most importantly, also need to have a common and firm African position on these issues that actually would be backed by strong political commitment and so as in tandem with our those who really actually are very keen on solving the issue, make sure that we have well functioning and transparent a carbon market that really remunerate countries or actors in a fair, in a comparable manner, and that do not necessarily actually introduce those distortion, from one country to another. And I think one issue that would be really important is to make sure that we introduce more and more transparencies to make sure that we can see how carbon are traded from one region to another, from one country to another, because I think that would really help also clarify the issue and how important it is to solve it. So that's for one. One other issue that is important is institutions like yours, UNDP, to keep playing the role that they have been playing in terms of advocacy to make sure that developing countries do have fair remuneration in carbon markets when they are put in place. I think this is a joint responsibility of African countries, but also of the multilateral institution, but also the global community at large. Because when we talked about climate change, as we always said, this is not an African matter. This is not a Gabonese matter. This is a world matter, and we have to have solutions that really are implemented by all the global community, whether they're African countries, whether they're Asian countries or European countries or American countries. I think it's extremely critical that every actor play his part, but it has to be done in a transparent manner. It has to be done in an accountable manner, because also it is important that those decisions that are taken really implemented. I think that's the most important issue also, because if we do agree on deals and we don't implement them, I think at the same time we are unfortunately seeing the world actually going to in a bad direction. So I think it's important that we try to push for that to happen, and that's the job of course, African government, but that's also the job of civil society. That's the job of the private sector, and that's also the job of the UN and other multilateral institutions, whether the World Bank, the IMF, and UNCTAD and others. I think it's important that we certainly make it happen. Maybe, hopefully, by doing that, we would be avoiding those type of distortion that you highlighted, that would actually make some countries less likely to get a fair share of the carbon market than other countries around the world.
Thank you so much, Dauda. And obviously, this is why we're having conversations like this, put collective efforts together to be able to address some of these challenges. We have 3 minutes left, and I know that we are all of you are so busy, so even getting an hour earlier on, I don't really want to be able to go beyond that time. I want to use these 3 minutes to have some final thoughts from all of you, and I'll start with you, Asana. Obviously, we've touched on the needs for partnerships, and I think Asana you were very critical about even the AFCFT and looking at what opportunities there could be. We've talked about engaging, creating innovative ways to bring in the financing in climate change, but also I think for me, as we continue the dialogue, obviously this is not our last conversation we are having. We hope to have as many as we head to COP28, but also as we work with all of you. What would be your final thoughts as we move on from here? Where do we start from, and how do we move forward?
So thank you so much, Maggie. I definitely do align with a lot of the points that were raised by Dauda and Raymond, especially when it comes to Article 6. At GGGI, we are currently working in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, specifically focusing on 6.4 and 6.2. What we want to make sure is to avoid some of the challenges of a lot of African countries that happened in the past, which is accumulating debt, entering markets without the capacity nor the understanding of the market itself. And what we've been doing is the technical training at the senior and high level with government officials and preparing them to understand what is Article 6, what is the Glasgow Agreement, how can each country benefit at the national level and also at the international level. We also discuss and do trainings on IPMOs, avoiding countries so that they will not have double counting. So for me, I think Article 6 is a key player for a lot of African countries if the decision makers, as mentioned by Dauda, understand the rules of the engagement and the rules of the game. The carbon trading can be advantageous. The debt for nature swap as well, we've been working with IIED on that, and that's something that it takes governments to say, I'm ready to open my finances and my budget and say, this is what's on my fiscal, this is what's on my debt, this is what I'm open. So these are hard conversations that government officials and countries have to also understand. But before you do so, we need to also acknowledge that a lot of countries and also private institutions have done a lot of trading on the market without even looking at the global international markets and losing a lot of revenue because they didn't understand the games and they didn't understand the rules of what is Article 6 in terms of carbon trading and what is the capacity. So what we are doing in terms of DDGI is we're developing with the government a national policy that will enable Senegal to have a global policy to negotiate at the national level, because you have a private sector and you have the of course, the public sector. So the two need to know what are the rules of the two sectors, but a policy at the national level needs to start. And then we can think about the continental level and maybe the regional level before we go at the international level. So that's something I would say. I think the fundamentals have been addressed in some of the key points raised by Dauda and Raymond. I will say that the collaboration, the PPPs and the partnerships, blended finance is key, but most importantly, Raymond raised a very critical point. Accumulation of debt is not the solution. We need to look at the grants, we need to look at blended finance, and we also need to look at research and making sure the key players that are actually at decision-making tables, negotiation tables, understand the rules and the policies. Because many countries do not understand, and I've seen a lot of discussions where different platforms, for example, for the carbon markets are going to be created, but how many are viable? How many actually follow the rules and regulations? And also when you're talking about carbon, there are different sectors. For example, for us, we're doing 6.4, 6.2, that's only focusing on energy. What else are the other markets that we have to look at sustainable forests, be looking at landscapes and forestry. So these are things that we need to understand. And for me, I think it's that grasping of the knowledge, equipping those that are making the key decision makers at the table to know this, so that when they go, they're negotiating at the advantageous level for the African continent and also at the country as a whole. And we need to also maybe redefine some of these laws in Glasgow, because what is considered to be X may not potentially be X in Africa as well. So I will say that to me it's accumulation of multiple things, but most importantly, mobilizing resources. We need to find innovative solutions to do it. The creation of green jobs, the inclusion of women, I think is very important. I noticed that one of the key things I said to someone is when I saw the picture that was taken at COP27 recently, and I said, where are the women? So inclusion of women is key. Gender balance, green job creation, and I'll stop there. Mobilization of resources. I think we need to look at the interest rates. We need to stop accumulation of, it's like Dambiso Moyo says, debt aid is not the answer. And I think it's time for us to change the language. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Asana. I have to say we were really very intentional about putting gender, balance into this session. So I hope this could be a kind of a start to many more conferences we're going to be attending. Raymond, I want to bring you in for some closing remarks, and then Dauda, and then we will, I think, have to close it at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think Asana has really provided a very great summary of all the key issues. I'll just like to go back to the theme for this conversation: climate financing, could it unlock Africa's development prospects? I think absolutely. I don't see climate financing as an add-on, as something additional that Africa has to do. I think that as African countries, African communities, and African people think about the future, it has to be one that is climate friendly, because protecting the planet is also reducing the costs of climate change in the community. You have to go together. And I think that this is why when we're talking about climate financing, we cannot divorce it from the conversation about development financing and financing development, because the two are not just symbiotic. I think that they are mutually reinforcing. And so the innovations that are necessary not just because of the process, but also because the reality is that the traditional sources of development assistance are drying up, or they are also stressed because of the pandemic and the war in Europe. So this is the time for, I think, African countries and African institutions to say, this is an abundantly resource endowed continent. Let us find ways to ensure that we could maximize the returns to the continent from its resources to address the challenges that it has. Primary challenge, I would say, is development, getting people out of poverty, investing in human capital, reducing inequalities. But an allied priority has to be climate financing, moving away from high polluting ways of doing things to more efficient and cost effective ways to deliver the services and the goods that Africa needs for the next few decades, at least. Thank you.
I want to bring in Dauda for closing remarks.
Thank you, Maggie. I believe it is has been said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. My sense also is that the climate crisis is a terrible thing for the global community to waste, and we certainly need to very much respond urgently to the crisis that we are facing. Broad consensus on how to address the crisis. We actually talked about the importance and the criticality of partnership between the public and the private, partnership between actually the various actors within the public sector, partnership at large. And this is something that we are committed as in our legal on our side at Africa Catalyst to help and nurture those partnerships. We're also very much committed to help push forward the research on climate finance and climate action in Africa, and what type of policy response are needed, and also what type of financing need we're talking about. We're also very much committed in supporting also in be part of the conversation through capacity building, in supporting actually the policy makers, but also actors that are involved in this. I think what we actually very much welcome is this convergence with our colleague from UNDP, but also from GGGI, and I'm hoping that we will be able to move forward, actually have opportunities to collaborate with them, but in general, actually with all actors that may be actually involved. We want to do this to certainly contribute to finding the right solutions. And at the end of the day, we only have one word. If we waste it, unfortunately, we won't have another word to leave to our future generation. We need to so take good care of it, and that requires the collective action from all of us.
Thank you so much, Dauda, for the closing remarks. I want to leave with this. I saw one quote at the concluded COP27 from our Flex Demand. I think the chief economist said, without just climate financing, there will not be a just transition. So it's very critical that we have conversations like this, especially now, and be able to collaborate, forge partnerships from private, public sector, but also the civil society. That brings us to the end of this conversation. Dauda, thank you so much for making time. Asana, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. And Raymond, thank you so much. My hope is that we can continue this, and obviously different topics that also maybe this doesn't end on a virtual conference. Hopefully we can be able to collaborate and work together in this space and be able to towards a better good. Thanks again for making the time this evening, and I will end the live here. So now we can interact.
Thank you.
I will edit this later.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And again, my apologies
you
with the technicalities. You can never prepare for them, but I hope next time we'll plan them better.
Well, I'm very sorry about that. And Asana and Raymond, it's a pleasure to actually have this opportunity to have this conversation with you. I am hoping that we